Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the remote wilderness of Appalachia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1963, the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia held secrets that would challenge everything we thought we knew about human disappearances in the wilderness. The case of Elias Coldwell, a seasoned park ranger with over 15 years of experience in the most treacherous terrain of the Appalachian Trail, began not with a dramatic event, but with something far more unsettling: the complete absence of any logical explanation. Coldwell had been assigned to patrol the remote sections of what is now known as the George Washington National Forest, specifically a 40-square-mile area that included some of the most isolated hiking trails in Virginia. The region, characterized by dense oak and maple forests, steep ridges and deep hollows that seemed to swallow sound itself, had always been considered challenging but manageable terrain for an experienced ranger. On October 15, 1963, Coldwell failed to return from what should have been a routine 3-day patrol of the northwestern quadrant of his assigned territory. His route included Devil's Backbone Ridge, a narrow spine of rock that connected two larger peaks, and the Whispering Hollow Trail System, a network of paths that descended into valleys so deep that radio contact became impossible once a person ventured more than half a mile from the main ridge. What made Coldwell's disappearance immediately troubling to his supervisors was not just his failure to return, but the discovery of his vehicle. His Forest Service truck was found parked at the designated checkpoint, exactly where protocol required it to be. His personal effects were secured inside. His thermos still contained coffee, and his logbook showed meticulous entries up until the morning of October the 13th. The final entry read, "Beginning descent into Hollow Section 7. Weather clear. Visibility good. All equipment functioning normally." Coldwell had been born in 1921 in the small town of Luray, Virginia, just 30 miles from the forest where he would eventually vanish. He had grown up in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, learning to hunt and fish from his grandfather, Elias Coldwell, a man who had worked as a surveyor for the Civilian Conservation Corps during the 1930s. Local residents remember Elias as a quiet but capable individual who seemed to understand the mountains in a way that went beyond mere familiarity. The Coldwell family had deep roots in the region, with records showing their presence in Shenandoah County dating back to the 1840s. Elias Coldwell had been among the first surveyors to map the remote areas that would eventually become part of the National Forest System, and family stories suggested he had discovered cave systems and geological formations that were never included in official surveys. These stories, dismissed by most as family folklore, would take on new significance as investigators began to understand the true scope of Elias Coldwell's disappearance. Those who knew Coldwell described him as methodical to the point of obsession. He maintained detailed personal records of weather patterns, animal behavior, and trail conditions dating back to 1948, when he first began working for the Forest Service. His small cabin on the outskirts of Luray contained hundreds of handwritten notebooks, each one meticulously organized by date and location. Neighbors reported that Coldwell would often spend his evenings transferring observations from field notes to these permanent records, a process that could take hours for a single day's work. The cabin itself reflected Coldwell's systematic approach to life. Every tool had a designated place, every piece of equipment was maintained according to a rigid schedule, and every surface was kept immaculately clean. Visitors described the interior as more laboratory than home, with charts and maps covering the walls and multiple filing systems containing decades of accumulated data about forest conditions throughout central Virginia. The ranger's personal life was notably sparse. He had never married, maintained few close friendships, and seemed to find his primary satisfaction in the solitude of his forest patrols. His sister, Cordelia Vance, lived in Richmond and visited perhaps twice a year. She later told investigators that her brother had always been drawn to places where other people seldom ventured, describing him as someone who seemed uncomfortable in crowds but completely at peace when surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Cordelia provided investigators with insights into her brother's personality that helped explain his dedication to documenting natural phenomena. As a young man, Elias had shown exceptional aptitude for mathematics and natural sciences, earning a scholarship to attend the University of Virginia in 1939. However, family financial difficulties had forced him to abandon his studies after just 2 years, a disappointment that Cordelia believed had shaped his approach to his Forest Service career. Rather than viewing his work as simply a job, Elias had apparently seen his forest patrols as opportunities to conduct the scientific observations he had been unable to pursue in an academic setting. Cordelia described finding him as a teenager, sitting motionless for hours in the woods behind their family home, recording the movements of individual animals and the patterns of plant growth with the dedication of a professional researcher. This attention to detail extended to his relationships with other Forest Service personnel. Colleagues described Coldwell as reliable but distant, someone who fulfilled his duties perfectly but seldom engaged in the casual conversation and camaraderie that characterized most ranger stations. He was known for arriving early, staying late, and volunteering for the most remote and difficult assignments, particularly those that involved extended periods alone in the wilderness. Coldwell's supervisor, District Ranger William Hartwell, had assigned him to the remote patrols specifically because of his competence in difficult terrain. Hartwell noted in his official report that Coldwell had never missed a check-in during his entire career, had never requested early extraction from a patrol, and had never filed a report that contained gaps or inconsistencies. This made his disappearance all the more baffling to those who knew his work habits. The relationship between Hartwell and Coldwell had been purely professional, built on mutual respect but little personal connection. Hartwell later admitted to investigators that he had come to rely on Coldwell's expertise to the point where he rarely questioned his decisions or methods. This level of trust had allowed Coldwell considerable autonomy in how he conducted his patrols, autonomy that would prove significant as the investigation into his disappearance revealed the extent of his unauthorized activities. Hartwell's confidence in Coldwell was based on 15 years of exemplary service, during which the ranger had developed an almost legendary reputation for his knowledge of the forest. Other rangers often consulted him about trail conditions, weather patterns, and wildlife behavior, treating him as an unofficial expert whose opinions carried more weight than official meteorological reports or biological surveys. This reputation extended beyond the Forest Service to local hunters, hikers, and outdoor enthusiasts who had come to view Coldwell as the definitive authority on the remote areas of the Blue Ridge Mountains. His recommendations about safe routes, seasonal hazards, and optimal camping locations were sought after and carefully followed by anyone planning extended trips into the wilderness. The search for Coldwell began on October 16th, when his failure to report for duty triggered standard protocols. Initial efforts focused on the area around his last known position, based on his logbook entries. Search teams found his first overnight campsite exactly where his notes indicated it should be, complete with the remains of a properly extinguished fire, and evidence that he had followed standard procedures for food storage and waste disposal. The campsite showed all the hallmarks of Coldwell's methodical approach to wilderness living. The fire pit had been constructed according to Forest Service guidelines, with a proper rock ring and adequate clearance from surrounding vegetation. Food containers were properly sealed and hung at the correct height and distance from the sleeping area to prevent animal intrusion. Even the arrangement of his temporary shelter showed the careful attention to detail that characterized all of Coldwell's work. Search team leader Captain Marcus Thorne, a veteran of multiple wilderness rescue operations, noted that the campsite was one of the most professionally arranged he had ever encountered. Every aspect of the setup demonstrated not just knowledge of proper procedures, but an almost obsessive attention to safety and environmental protection. Thorne later commented that the site looked more like a training demonstration than an actual overnight camp used by someone traveling alone. The second campsite, where Coldwell should have spent the night of October 13th, was located after 12 hours of intensive searching. Here, the situation became considerably more puzzling. The campsite showed signs of normal preparation, a cleared area for sleeping, rocks arranged for a fire pit, and marks indicating where he had hung his pack from a tree branch. However, there was no evidence that a fire had ever been lit, no indication that food had been prepared, and no sign of the heavy sleeping equipment that Coldwell would have carried for an overnight stay in October weather. What search teams found instead was Coldwell's official logbook, placed precisely in the center of what would have been the fire pit. The book was open to a page that should have contained his entry for October 13th evening, but the page was completely blank. More unsettling was the fact that the logbook appeared to have been deliberately positioned, as if left for someone to find. The book showed no signs of weather damage, despite being exposed to a night of heavy dew and intermittent rain. The positioning of the logbook suggested a level of intentionality that contradicted the possibility of accidental loss or abandonment. The book had been placed with obvious care, open to the specific blank page, and weighted down with small rocks to prevent it from being disturbed by wind. This arrangement required deliberate thought and effort, indicating that whoever had placed it there had intended it to be discovered and examined. Captain Thorne photographed the scene extensively before disturbing any evidence, noting that the entire campsite gave the impression of having been arranged as a message rather than used for its intended purpose. The cleared sleeping area was too perfectly geometric, the rock arrangement for the fire pit was too symmetrical, and the hanging marks on the tree branch were too evenly spaced to represent natural usage by someone setting up camp in failing light. Expanded search efforts over the following week covered nearly 60 square miles of forest. Teams included experienced mountain rescue personnel, local volunteers familiar with the terrain, and bloodhounds brought in from the state police. The dogs were able to follow Coldwell's scent from his vehicle to the first campsite, and from the first campsite to the second. But at the second site, all trails simply ended. The dogs showed clear signs of confusion, circling the area repeatedly, but unable to pick up any scent, leading away from the campsite in any direction. The behavior of the bloodhounds was particularly puzzling to their handlers, who had extensive experience in wilderness tracking operations. The dogs appeared to pick up Coldwell's scent strongly at the second campsite, but then displayed behavior that suggested the scent simply vanished rather than continuing in any particular direction. This pattern was consistent with the subject having been picked up by vehicle, but the terrain around the campsite made vehicle access impossible. Additional tracking dogs were brought in from other agencies to confirm these results, but each team produced identical findings. The dogs could follow Coldwell's trail to the second campsite with no difficulty, but beyond that point, they could find no trace of his passage. Handler Sergeant Robert Crane noted in his report that the dogs' behavior suggested they were encountering a situation they had never experienced before, something that contradicted their training and instincts. The scent trail ending so completely and abruptly led investigators to consider several possibilities, none of which seemed entirely satisfactory. The terrain was too rough for vehicle extraction, there was no evidence of struggle that might suggest foul play, and weather conditions had been stable enough that natural factors should not have eliminated all traces of human passage. During this intensive search period, teams uncovered several items that appeared to belong to Coldwell, but their discovery raised more questions than answers. His compass was found hanging from a branch approximately 1 mile southeast of the second campsite in an area that made no logical sense given his intended route. The compass was suspended at eye level, as if deliberately placed for maximum visibility, yet it was located in terrain so difficult that reaching it would have required significant effort and deviation from any reasonable path. The compass itself was in perfect working condition, showing no signs of damage or malfunction that might explain why it had been abandoned. More puzzling was its position, which suggested that whoever had hung it there possessed detailed knowledge of the search patterns that would be employed by rescue teams. The location was far enough off the main search grid to avoid immediate discovery, but positioned along a route that thorough searchers would eventually follow. Investigation of the area around the compass revealed additional signs that someone had spent considerable time in the vicinity. Small cairns marked a path leading from the compass location toward even more difficult terrain, and several trees showed signs of having been used for rope anchoring, suggesting technical climbing activity. These signs indicated a level of planning and preparation that contradicted the theory of accidental disorientation or emergency abandonment. 2 days later, searchers located Coldwell's water canteen, buried under a pile of leaves near a creek that was more than 2 miles from his planned route. The canteen was empty, but showed no signs of damage or wear that would indicate it had been dropped or abandoned accidentally. Like the compass, its placement seemed intentional, but the location made no practical sense for someone following standard patrol procedures, or even for someone who had become lost and was attempting to find his way back to familiar territory. The burial of the canteen was particularly troubling to investigators, as it suggested forethought and effort that contradicted most explanations for Coldwell's disappearance. The pile of leaves appeared to have been carefully arranged to conceal the canteen, while still allowing it to be found by systematic searchers. The location near the creek provided a logical place for someone to search for water sources, making discovery likely but not immediate. Analysis of the canteen revealed that it had been completely drained and cleaned before being buried, indicating that its abandonment had been planned rather than forced by circumstances. The metal showed no signs of rust or corrosion that would suggest extended exposure to moisture, and the cap was properly tightened to prevent contamination. These details suggested that whoever had buried it had taken care to preserve it in good condition. The creek itself provided additional clues that deepened the mystery. The location where the canteen was found was approximately 50 yards upstream from a natural pool that would have provided an ideal water source for someone traveling through the area. However, there were no signs of recent human activity around the pool, no footprints or disturbed vegetation that would indicate someone had stopped to rest or refill equipment. The most disturbing discovery came during the second week of searching, when a team working the steep slopes below Devil's Backbone Ridge found what appeared to be pages from Coldwell's personal notebooks. The pages had been torn out carefully, not ripped, and were discovered scattered across a small clearing approximately 50 yards from the main trail. The pages contained observations about wildlife behavior, weather patterns, and trail conditions, but they were dated from various months throughout 1963, not from his current patrol. What made this discovery particularly troubling was the apparent randomness of the selected pages. There was no obvious connection between the different entries, no common theme or location that linked them together. However, a closer examination by investigators revealed that each page contained at least one reference to unusual sounds heard in the forest. Descriptions of calls that didn't match known wildlife, sounds that seemed to echo from underground or periods of complete silence that lasted far longer than would be natural in a healthy forest ecosystem. The pages themselves were in remarkably good condition, considering they had been found outdoors during a period of variable weather. They showed minimal damage from moisture or UV exposure, suggesting they had been protected somehow before being scattered in the clearing. The careful removal from the notebooks indicated deliberate selection rather than accidental loss during travel. Handwriting analysis confirmed that the pages were genuine examples of Coldwell's documentation, but the selection process remained a mystery. The pages spanned the entire year, from January through September 1963, but they were not consecutive pages from any single notebook. Instead, they appeared to have been chosen from multiple different volumes, requiring access to Coldwell's entire personal archive. The references to unusual sounds became a focus of investigation, as they suggested that Coldwell had been documenting anomalous phenomena throughout his patrol area for an extended period. The descriptions were technical and detailed, suggesting careful observation rather than casual notation. Several entries included attempts to estimate direction, duration, and acoustic characteristics of sounds that Coldwell could not identify or explain. Most significant were notations about sounds that appeared to come from underground, often accompanied by observations about changes in animal behavior that seemed to correlate with these acoustic events. Coldwell had documented patterns suggesting that local wildlife avoided certain areas during periods when the underground sounds were most prominent, returning only after extended periods of silence. The official search was scaled back after 3 weeks, though volunteer efforts continued for several more months. The Forest Service issued a statement acknowledging that, despite extensive efforts involving multiple agencies and experienced personnel, no conclusive evidence had been found regarding Ranger Coldwell's fate. The case remained open but inactive, filed under unexplained disappearances. District Ranger Hartwell found himself in the difficult position of managing both the practical aspects of losing an experienced ranger and the growing public interest in the case. Media attention had begun to focus on the unusual aspects of Coldwell's disappearance, particularly the scattered evidence that suggested deliberate rather than accidental circumstances. Hartwell was forced to implement new patrol procedures that required pairs of rangers for remote area assignments, effectively reducing coverage of the wilderness areas. The local community response to Coldwell's disappearance reflected the respect and concern he had earned during his years of service. Volunteer search efforts included hunters, hikers, and outdoor enthusiasts who had benefited from his expertise and wanted to contribute to finding him. These volunteers proved invaluable in covering terrain that would have been impossible for official search teams to navigate thoroughly. However, the story of Elias Coldwell's vanishing was far from over. In the months following the official end of the search, hunters and hikers using the trails in Coldwell's assigned territory began reporting experiences that suggested something profoundly unsettling about the area where he had disappeared. These reports, collected informally by local law enforcement and Forest Service personnel, painted a picture of a landscape that seemed to have fundamentally changed since October 1963. Multiple individuals reported encountering areas of complete silence while hiking trails that had previously been filled with the normal sounds of forest life. These zones of silence were not consistent in location, appearing to move randomly throughout the forest, but they were always described in similar terms: a sudden cessation of all sound, including wind, that would last for periods ranging from several minutes to over an hour. The silent zones were particularly disturbing to experienced woodsmen who understood that healthy forest ecosystems maintain constant background noise from insects, birds, and small mammals. The complete absence of these sounds indicated either the presence of a major predator that had frightened all other wildlife into hiding, or environmental conditions so unusual that normal biological activity had been disrupted. Local hunter Jasper Branscombe, who had used the trails in Coldwell's territory for over 20 years, reported encountering such a silent zone in late November 1963. According to his account, he had been tracking a deer through familiar terrain when all forest sounds suddenly stopped. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat and the rustle of his clothing with unusual clarity. Branscombe described the experience as profoundly unnerving, unlike anything he had encountered in decades of hunting in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The silence lasted approximately 45 minutes, during which he remained motionless, waiting for normal forest sounds to resume. When the ambient noise finally returned, it did so gradually, starting with insect sounds and building slowly back to normal levels. More unsettling were reports of signs that appeared to be left by Coldwell himself. Hikers found carefully arranged rock cairns in locations where no trail markers had previously existed. These cairns were constructed using techniques consistent with those taught in Forest Service training, but they marked paths that led into areas of extremely dangerous terrain, including steep drop-offs and unstable rock formations. The cairns appeared overnight, with no witnesses to their construction, despite the remote locations and difficult access involved. Each one was built according to professional standards, using stones selected for stability and arranged in patterns that would remain visible from multiple directions. However, the trails they marked were unsuitable for normal hiking and led toward areas that experienced outdoorsmen would instinctively avoid. Investigation of several cairn locations revealed that they were positioned at points where following their indicated direction would lead hikers into serious danger within a few hundred yards. The paths led toward cliff edges, unstable slopes, and dense undergrowth that would trap unwary followers. This pattern suggested either deliberate malice or profound disorientation on the part of whoever was constructing them. Forest Service personnel systematically documented each cairn discovery, creating detailed maps and photographic records. The construction techniques were consistent across all findings, suggesting a single builder with professional training in wilderness navigation and trail marking. However, the dangerous nature of the indicated routes contradicted the safety-first principles that characterized all legitimate Forest Service activities. In December 1963, a hunting party discovered what appeared to be a temporary shelter constructed in a style identical to those taught in Coldwell's survival training courses. The shelter was located in a region that the missing ranger had never been assigned to patrol, nearly 20 miles from his last known position. Inside the shelter, investigators found a single page torn from a Forest Service manual, the section dealing with procedures for signaling rescue teams. The page showed signs of heavy use, as if it had been read repeatedly. The shelter itself was a masterpiece of wilderness engineering, constructed using only materials available in the immediate area, but arranged with professional skill. The framework was lashed together using techniques that would provide maximum stability with minimum material, and the weatherproofing showed understanding of advanced survival principles. The construction would have required several hours of careful work by someone with extensive training and experience. Inside the shelter, investigators found evidence of extended occupation. A fire pit had been dug according to safety regulations with proper ventilation and spark containment features. Sleeping areas were arranged to maximize warmth retention and minimize exposure to ground moisture. Food storage areas showed evidence of systematic organization and protection from animal intrusion. The page from the Forest Service manual was the only item in the shelter that clearly connected it to Coldwell's disappearance. The page dealt specifically with methods for creating signals that would be visible to aerial search efforts, including techniques for arranging rocks, clearing vegetation, and positioning reflective materials. The extensive wear on the page suggested it had been consulted frequently, possibly as someone attempted to decide whether or not to signal for rescue. Analysis of the shelter's location revealed that it was positioned to be invisible from normal hiking trails, but accessible to someone with detailed knowledge of the terrain. The site provided natural protection from weather while maintaining sight lines that would allow observation of activity in the surrounding area. These characteristics suggested careful selection based on specific criteria rather than opportunistic use of available materials. The pattern of discoveries continued throughout the winter months. A compass bearing scratched into a large oak tree, pointing toward an area where search teams had found no trace of Coldwell. A series of small rock arrows, arranged according to Forest Service trail marking standards, leading from a main hiking path into dense undergrowth, where no human could reasonably be expected to travel. Each discovery followed the same pattern, professionally executed using techniques that Coldwell would have known, but placed in locations that made no logical sense for someone trying to be rescued or to find his way back to safety. The compass bearing carved into the oak tree was particularly puzzling, as it pointed directly toward one of the most inaccessible areas in Coldwell's former patrol territory. The bearing was precisely calculated and deeply carved, suggesting both accuracy and permanence. However, following that bearing would require traversing terrain so difficult that it would challenge even experienced mountaineers with proper equipment. The carving itself showed evidence of careful planning and execution. The bearing was marked using standard surveying notation with degree measurements that were accurate to within minutes of arc. The depth and precision of the cuts indicated the use of proper tools and considerable time investment. This level of detail contradicted the possibility of hasty or desperate communication. The rock arrows leading into dense undergrowth were equally mysterious as they guided followers toward areas where travel became increasingly dangerous. The arrows were spaced at regular intervals, maintaining consistent direction despite changes in terrain that would normally require route adjustment. Following them required forcing passage through vegetation so thick that forward progress became nearly impossible after a few dozen yards. Local authorities began to theorize that Coldwell might have suffered some form of psychological break, perhaps triggered by an accident or medical emergency during his patrol. This hypothesis seemed to explain the deliberate nature of the signs he appeared to be leaving, while also accounting for their increasingly erratic placement. However, this theory failed to address several key aspects of the case that investigators found impossible to reconcile with any known pattern of behavior associated with confusion or disorientation. The first problem with the psychological break theory was the level of skill and planning required to create the signs that were being found. Each marker, whether a cairn, shelter, or a ranged stone pattern, demonstrated the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized Coldwell's work throughout his career. Rather than showing signs of deteriorating mental capacity, the construction techniques appeared to be improving, becoming more sophisticated and harder to detect with each discovery. Dr. Helena Whitmore, a psychiatrist consulted by law enforcement, reviewed the evidence and expressed skepticism about the psychological break theory. According to her analysis, the deliberate nature of the sign placement and the consistent application of professional techniques suggested cognitive function that remained largely intact. She noted that most forms of psychological disorientation would produce increasingly erratic behavior, not the methodical approach evident in the discovered markers. The second issue was the apparent randomness of the locations, which seemed to follow no pattern that search teams could identify. Coldwell had known the forest well enough to navigate even without a compass, yet the markers suggested someone who was moving through the terrain in a way that ignored established trails, water sources, and natural landmarks that any experienced woodsman would use for navigation. Analysis of the marker locations using topographic maps revealed no obvious strategic or practical logic to their placement. They were not positioned to mark sources of food or water, did not indicate safe travel routes, and did not appear to form any recognizable pattern when viewed as a whole. This randomness contradicted the systematic approach that had characterized all of Coldwell's previous work. The third and most troubling aspect was the timing of the discoveries. While some markers appeared to have been created recently, others showed signs of weathering that suggested they had been in place for months, possibly predating Coldwell's disappearance entirely. This raised the possibility that the missing ranger had been placing unexplained markers throughout his territory for an extended period before October 1963, a behavior that no one who knew him had ever observed. Detailed examination of weathering patterns by Forest Service experts suggested that several markers had been in place since at least the spring of 1963, and possibly earlier. This timeline indicated that whatever had motivated Coldwell to create these signs had been developing over months or years, not as a sudden response to emergency or crisis during his final patrol. As winter gave way to spring 1964, the frequency of discoveries began to increase rather than diminish. Hikers and hunters reported finding new markers on an almost weekly basis, always constructed using the same professional techniques, always located in places that served no apparent navigational purpose. Forest Service personnel began to systematically document these findings, creating detailed maps that showed the locations and approximate dates of each discovery. The increase in discoveries during the spring months suggested that the marker placement was continuing despite Coldwell's presumed death or departure from the area. This possibility forced investigators to consider that either Coldwell had somehow survived and remained active in the forest, or someone else with identical training and knowledge had taken over the marker placement activity. The systematic documentation effort was led by Assistant District Ranger Patricia Henley, who had worked with Coldwell for several years and was familiar with his methods and techniques. Henley's analysis confirmed that the markers were being constructed using procedures that were specific to Forest Service training, including details that would not be known to civilian hikers or hunters. The pattern that emerged from this documentation was unlike anything investigators had seen before. The markers appeared to be forming a rough spiral shape when viewed from above, with the center of the spiral located at a point deep in Whispering Hollow, an area so remote and difficult to access that it had rarely been thoroughly explored even by experienced Forest Service personnel. The spiral pattern became apparent only after months of documentation, as individual marker locations that had seemed random began to show relationships when plotted on detailed topographic maps. The spiral covered an area of approximately 25 square miles, with markers positioned at intervals that maintained consistent spacing despite radical changes in terrain elevation and accessibility. The mathematical precision of the spiral pattern suggested planning on a scale that contradicted theories of random placement or disoriented wandering. The marker positions required calculations that would have involved detailed knowledge of surveying and navigation principles, as well as access to accurate maps and measuring instruments. In May 1964, a team of investigators decided to attempt to reach the center of this apparent spiral. The expedition required specialized climbing equipment and took 2 full days of careful progress down into the hollow. What they found at the presumed center of the marker pattern was a natural cave system that had not been documented in any previous survey of the area. The descent into Whispering Hollow proved more challenging than anticipated, requiring technical climbing skills that few Forest Service personnel possessed. The expedition team included professional mountaineers borrowed from other agencies, along with geological experts capable of assessing cave systems for safety and accessibility. The approach to the cave entrance required navigating terrain so steep and unstable that it had apparently discouraged previous exploration efforts. The hollow itself was so deep that radio communication with the surface became impossible once the team descended beyond the first few hundred feet. This isolation meant that the expedition had to be completely self-sufficient, with no possibility of emergency extraction if conditions deteriorated. The caves appeared to extend deep into the mountain, with multiple chambers and passages that had been carved by underground water flow over thousands of years. At the entrance to the main chamber, investigators found evidence of recent human presence, remnants of several fires, carefully arranged sleeping areas, and a cache of supplies that included Forest Service equipment identified as belonging to Elias Coldwell. The cave entrance was partially concealed by vegetation and rockfall, making it nearly invisible unless approached from a specific direction. The concealment appeared to be partly natural and partly deliberate, with evidence that someone had arranged fallen rocks and encouraged plant growth to further obscure the opening. Inside the cave, the evidence of human habitation was extensive and sophisticated. Multiple fire pits had been constructed according to safety principles that would prevent carbon monoxide accumulation, with carefully engineered ventilation systems that drew fresh air from the surface. The sleeping areas were arranged to maximize warmth retention and minimize humidity exposure, using techniques that demonstrated advanced understanding of cave environment management. However, the supplies raised new questions rather than providing answers. The cache included items that Coldwell could not have been carrying during his October patrol. Winter camping equipment suitable for extended stays in below-freezing conditions, enough preserved food for several weeks, and multiple sets of Forest Service manuals and reference materials. The equipment appeared to have been accumulated gradually over an extended period, suggesting that Coldwell had been making repeated trips to this location long before his official disappearance. Inventory of the cached supplies revealed a level of preparation that indicated long-term planning rather than emergency survival. The food supplies were professionally preserved and stored according to principles that would maintain nutritional value over extended periods. The camping equipment was selected for durability and efficiency, with items that would provide maximum functionality while requiring minimum maintenance. The reference materials included technical manuals dealing with cave exploration, geological survey techniques, and underground navigation methods. These materials went far beyond the standard Forest Service training that Coldwell would have received, suggesting that he had been educating himself about specialized subjects related to underground exploration. More disturbing were the notebooks found in the cave. Written in Coldwell's careful handwriting, these books contained detailed observations of the cave system itself, including measurements of chambers, maps of passages, and notes about water sources and airflow. The earliest entries were dated from 1961, indicating that Coldwell had been secretly exploring this area for at least 2 years before his disappearance. The notebooks revealed systematic exploration and documentation that would have required hundreds of hours of underground work. The maps showed passages that extended far beyond the areas accessible to the investigation team, with detailed notations about elevation changes, water levels, and structural stability. The level of detail suggested that Coldwell had achieved comprehensive knowledge of the cave system through extended exploration efforts. The content of these notebooks revealed a side of Coldwell that no one who knew him had ever seen. Rather than the straightforward observations of weather and wildlife that characterized his official reports, these private notes contained increasingly complex theories about what he described as patterns of movement in the forest above the cave system. He wrote extensively about sounds that occurred at regular intervals, always at night, that he believed were somehow connected to the cave system itself. According to these notes, Coldwell had become convinced that something was living in the deeper passages of the cave, something that followed patterns of behavior unlike any known wildlife. He described sounds that seemed to move through the underground chambers in organized sequences, suggesting a level of intelligence and purpose that he found deeply disturbing. His later entries showed increasing obsession with documenting these sounds and trying to predict when they would occur. The sound documentation was remarkably detailed, with precise timing notations and attempts to map the apparent movement patterns through the cave system. Coldwell had developed a notation system for categorizing different types of sounds, ranging from what he described as standard geological settling to organized acoustic sequences that seemed to follow predictable schedules. The predictable nature of some sound patterns had allowed Coldwell to develop what he called observation schedules, timing his underground visits to coincide with periods when the phenomena were most active. The notebooks contained detailed tables showing correlations between surface weather conditions, lunar phases, and the frequency of underground acoustic events. The final entries in Coldwell's cave notebooks were dated October 12, 1963, the day before his last official log entry. These pages revealed that he had been planning what he called a final observation session, an extended stay in the cave system, during which he intended to document the source of the sounds that had been capturing his attention for over 2 years. The plan outlined in these final notes called for Coldwell to use his official patrol as cover for an extended absence, during which he would position himself deep in the cave system during the period when he believed the sounds were most active. He had calculated that this period would last from October 13th through October 15th, based on patterns he had observed during his previous secret visits to the caves. Reading between the lines of Coldwell's final entries, investigators began to understand that the missing ranger had not disappeared accidentally or suffered any form of psychological break. Instead, he appeared to have deliberately arranged his own disappearance as part of a plan to spend an extended period underground, documenting whatever he believed was living in the deeper recesses of the cave system. The deliberate nature of Coldwell's disappearance was confirmed by additional evidence found throughout the cave complex. He had established multiple observation posts at different levels of the system, each one equipped with supplies and documentation materials that would allow extended surveillance of specific areas. The posts were connected by marked routes that would allow movement through the caves even in complete darkness. The observation posts demonstrated sophisticated understanding of cave acoustics and environmental conditions. Each one was positioned to maximize the ability to detect and document sound phenomena while minimizing the observer's impact on cave conditions that might affect the sounds themselves. The posts included equipment for measuring temperature, humidity, and air pressure changes that might correlate with acoustic events. This realization prompted authorities to organize a comprehensive exploration of the cave system using professional speleologists and specialized underground rescue teams. The caves proved to be far more extensive than initially suspected, with multiple levels and passages that extended for miles underground. Many of the passages required advanced technical climbing skills to navigate safely, and several areas could only be reached using specialized underwater exploration techniques. The professional exploration effort was the most comprehensive cave survey ever undertaken in Virginia, involving experts from universities, government agencies, and private organizations with specialized underground experience. The team used advanced mapping techniques, including sonar and laser measurement systems, to create detailed three-dimensional models of the cave structure. The exploration teams found extensive evidence of Coldwell's presence throughout the cave system. In chamber after chamber, they discovered carefully arranged observation posts, complete with seating areas, equipment caches, and detailed notes describing what he had observed from each position. The notes revealed that Coldwell had been systematically mapping not just the physical structure of the caves, but also patterns of sound and air movement that he believed indicated the presence of something living in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the system. The observation posts were engineering marvels in themselves, constructed using techniques that maximize stability while minimizing environmental impact. Coldwell had apparently taught himself advanced construction methods specifically for underground work, creating platforms and anchoring systems that could support extended observation sessions without damaging cave formations. The documentation found at each post revealed increasing sophistication in Coldwell's observation techniques. Earlier posts contained relatively simple notes about sound direction and duration, while later installations included complex timing equipment and acoustic measurement devices that he had apparently constructed himself using Forest Service electronics and improvised materials. What the exploration teams did not find was any trace of Coldwell himself, nor any evidence of the mysterious sounds that had captured his attention so completely. The caves were filled with the normal sounds of underground water flow, occasional rock movement, and the echo of the exploration team's own voices, but nothing that matched Coldwell's detailed descriptions of organized, intelligent activity. The absence of the documented sound phenomena led some investigators to conclude that Coldwell had been documenting natural cave acoustics that he had misinterpreted as evidence of unknown life forms. However, this explanation failed to account for the systematic nature of his observations and the apparent predictability of the patterns he had documented. Professional acoustics experts who reviewed Coldwell's documentation noted that his descriptions were technically sophisticated and included details that would be difficult to fabricate or imagine. The sound patterns he described showed characteristics that would be consistent with complex biological activity, including apparent communication sequences and coordinated movement patterns. However, in the deepest chamber that the teams were able to reach, they made a discovery that provided a final unsettling piece to the puzzle of Coldwell's disappearance. Carved into the rock wall of this chamber, using techniques that would have required considerable time and effort, was a detailed map of the cave system. The map included passages and chambers that had not been documented by the exploration teams, suggesting that it had been created by someone with far more extensive knowledge of the underground system than anyone had realized was possible. The carved map showed areas of the cave system that extended far beyond what the exploration teams had been able to reach, including passages that appeared to connect to other cave systems throughout the Blue Ridge Mountains. The level of detail suggested that the mapmaker had achieved comprehensive exploration of underground areas that would have required years of systematic work to document. Below the map, also carved into the rock, was a message in Coldwell's handwriting. The sounds go deeper than any human can follow, but the patterns continue. October 15, 1963, final observation complete. Below this message was carved the Forest Service motto, caring for the land and serving people, followed by Coldwell's badge number and years of service. The implications of this carved message were clear. Coldwell had completed whatever observation mission he had set for himself, but had concluded that whatever he was studying existed in parts of the cave system that were beyond human reach. The fact that he had taken the time to carve this message suggested that he had known it would be his final communication, that he did not expect to return to the surface world. The carving itself represented hours of careful work, executed with tools that would have required considerable effort to transport into the deep cave chamber. The precision of the lettering and the accuracy of the map details demonstrated that Coldwell had maintained his mental capabilities and technical skills throughout his underground ordeal. The message indicated that Coldwell believed he had accomplished his research objectives, but had discovered that the phenomena he was studying extended beyond areas that could be safely explored by human investigators. This conclusion suggested that he had made a deliberate decision to end his observation activities rather than continuing to pursue phenomena that he could not adequately document. The exploration team spent additional weeks attempting to locate the passages indicated on Coldwell's carved map, but many of them appeared to be blocked by rockfall or filled with water, to levels that made exploration impossible without equipment that was not available in 1964. Several passages seemed to lead to vertical drops that extended beyond the range of available climbing rope, while others disappeared into underwater sections that would have required professional diving equipment to navigate. The inaccessible areas shown on Coldwell's map suggested that the cave system was far more extensive than even the comprehensive 1964 exploration had revealed. The map indicated connections to surface features miles away from the main cave entrance, including areas that had never been surveyed for cave activity. This suggested that Coldwell had achieved understanding of underground geography that exceeded all previous knowledge of the region. Professional geologists who studied Coldwell's carved map noted that it showed geological formations that were consistent with the known structure of the Blue Ridge Mountains, but included details about underground water systems and rock formations that had never been documented. The accuracy of these details suggested that Coldwell had somehow achieved direct observation of geological features that would normally require extensive drilling and survey work to discover. As the official exploration of the cave system concluded, authorities were forced to accept that they might never know exactly what had happened to Elias Coldwell during his final days underground. The evidence suggested that he had deliberately chosen to remain in the cave system, pursuing observations of phenomena that existed beyond the reach of rescue teams or investigators. The case was officially closed in August 1964, with Coldwell declared dead due to accidental death during performance of official duties. His personal effects were released to his sister, Cordelia Vance, who chose not to make the contents of his private notebooks public. The cave system was declared off-limits to recreational exploration and was removed from official Forest Service maps of the area. Cordelia's decision to keep her brother's research private reflected her belief that public disclosure of his underground observations would not serve any useful purpose and might encourage dangerous exploration attempts by unqualified individuals. She arranged for the notebooks to be sealed in a safety deposit box, with instructions that they should not be opened until at least 25 years after her death. The restriction of access to the cave system was implemented not only for public safety reasons, but also to preserve the integrity of areas that might contain additional evidence related to Coldwell's research. Forest Service officials recognized that the caves represented a unique environment that required protection from casual exploration that might damage formations or disturb ongoing geological processes. However, the story of Elias Coldwell and his mysterious disappearance continued to influence the region for years after the official case was closed. Forest Service personnel assigned to patrol the area around Whispering Hollow reported that the landscape itself seemed somehow different from other parts of the forest. These reports were subtle but consistent, areas that seemed unusually quiet, patches of forest where wildlife appeared to be absent for no obvious reason, and places where even experienced woodsmen reported feeling profoundly uneasy. The changes in the forest environment were documented through formal reports filed by multiple rangers over several years following Coldwell's disappearance. These reports noted alterations in wildlife behavior, changes in vegetation patterns, and atmospheric conditions that seemed inconsistent with normal forest ecology. While none of these changes were dramatic enough to pose immediate safety concerns, their consistency across multiple observations suggested that the area had been affected by factors that were not readily apparent. Hikers and hunters continued to find markers throughout the area, though these became increasingly rare as years passed. Each discovery followed the same pattern that had characterized the findings immediately after Coldwell's disappearance. Professional construction, careful placement, but no logical purpose related to navigation or safety. The markers seemed to serve no function except to indicate that someone with advanced knowledge of Forest Service procedures had passed through specific areas. The continuing discovery of markers years after Coldwell's presumed death raised questions about whether his research activities had somehow continued beyond his official disappearance. Some investigators theorized that he had established automated systems or taught others to continue his marker placement activities, though no evidence was ever found to support these theories. More troubling were reports from several individuals who claimed to have encountered a figure in Forest Service uniform in areas near Whispering Hollow. These sightings were always at a distance, always in poor light conditions, and always involved a person who moved through difficult terrain with the fluid ease of someone extremely familiar with the landscape. Attempts to approach or communicate with this figure always resulted in the person disappearing into areas too rough for followers to navigate safely. The sighting reports shared common characteristics that made them difficult to dismiss as simple misidentification. Witnesses consistently described someone wearing standard Forest Service uniform and equipment, moving with purpose through areas where casual hikers would struggle to maintain footing. The figure appeared to be conducting systematic observations of the forest, pausing frequently to examine specific areas before moving on to new locations. Local law enforcement investigated several of these reports, but never found evidence that would support the possibility that Coldwell had somehow survived his time in the cave system. The sightings were generally attributed to wishful thinking on the part of people who had been influenced by the publicity surrounding his disappearance, or to misidentification of other hikers or Forest Service personnel working in the area. However, the investigations revealed that the sightings occurred in areas where no other Forest Service personnel were known to be working, and during times when official patrols were documented to be in other parts of the forest. This pattern suggested that either the witnesses were mistaken about what they had seen, or someone was conducting unauthorized activities in the area using Forest Service equipment and procedures. By the late 1960s, reports of unusual activity in the Whispering Hollow area had become so infrequent that most people assumed the effects of Coldwell's disappearance had finally faded from local memory. The Forest Service had reassigned his patrol territory to other rangers, and the area had returned to its previous status as one of the most remote and seldom visited parts of the Virginia mountains. However, in 1969, 5 years after the official case had been closed, authorities received a report that forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Elias Coldwell's fate. A team of geologists conducting a survey for potential mining operations discovered a new entrance to the cave system where Coldwell had disappeared, an opening that appeared to have been created by recent seismic activity in the region. The new cave entrance was located approximately 3 miles from the original opening discovered in 1964, in an area that had previously shown no signs of underground chambers or passages. The entrance appeared to have been opened when a minor earthquake in the fall of 1968 had shifted rock formations enough to create access to previously sealed portions of the cave system. This new entrance provided access to parts of the underground system that had been unreachable during the 1964 exploration efforts. Professional cave exploration teams were able to navigate passages that led deeper into the mountain than anyone had previously thought possible. In these deeper chambers, they made discoveries that shed new light on Coldwell's final months, but also raised questions that may never be answered. The deeper chambers accessible through the new entrance showed signs of human presence that were more recent than the areas explored in 1964. The chambers contained observation posts similar to those found throughout the original cave system, but constructed using techniques that showed increased sophistication and refinement. The posts were equipped with measurement devices and documentation systems that represented advances over the equipment found in the original chambers. The deepest chamber accessible through the new entrance contained what appeared to be a long-term living area, carefully arranged with sleeping facilities, food storage, and observation equipment. The area showed signs of recent use, but also evidence that it had been occupied intermittently over several years. Among the supplies, investigators found personal items that had belonged to Coldwell, including his Forest Service identification and personal tools that he would have carried during his normal duties. The living area was arranged with the same attention to detail that had characterized all of Coldwell's work, but showed adaptations that suggested years of underground experience. The sleeping area was designed to maximize warmth and comfort in cave conditions using construction techniques that would have required extensive experimentation to perfect. The food storage systems showed understanding of preservation principles that went beyond standard survival training. More significantly, they found a series of notebooks that appeared to continue the observations Coldwell had been making before his disappearance. These notebooks contained entries dated well into 1965 and beyond, describing ongoing studies of what the writer continued to refer to as movement patterns in the deeper cave system. The handwriting was consistent with Coldwell's known samples, but showed subtle changes that suggested the physical stress of extended underground living. The notebooks revealed that Coldwell's research had continued for years beyond his official disappearance, with increasingly sophisticated documentation of phenomena that he believed existed in the deepest parts of the cave system. The later entries showed development of measurement techniques and observation protocols that represented significant advances over his initial documentation methods. The later entries in these notebooks revealed that Coldwell believed he had discovered something in the deepest parts of the cave system that challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural world. His descriptions became increasingly technical and difficult to understand, filled with measurements, calculations, and theories that seemed to relate to forms of life or geological activity that existed at depths no human had ever explored. According to these final notebooks, Coldwell had concluded that the sounds he had been documenting were not produced by any known form of life, but by geological processes occurring at depths that might extend for miles below the cave system. He theorized that these processes created acoustic effects that reached the surface through the cave passages, producing the mysterious sounds that had initially captured his attention. The geological processes described in Coldwell's later notebooks involved theoretical interactions between underground water systems, mineral formations, and seismic activity that would produce organized acoustic patterns. His theories suggested that these processes operated according to principles that were not yet understood by conventional geology, creating effects that could be mistaken for biological activity. The notebooks indicated that Coldwell had become convinced that these deep geological processes followed patterns that suggested some form of natural intelligence, patterns too complex and organized to be explained by random geological activity. His final entries described attempts to decode what he believed were systematic signals coming from deep within the mountain itself. The signal documentation filled hundreds of pages in the later notebooks, with detailed tables showing correlations between surface conditions, seismic activity, and underground acoustic patterns. Coldwell had apparently developed mathematical models that predicted when the signals would be strongest and what information they might contain. The last dated entry in these notebooks was from March 1967, over 3 years after Coldwell's official disappearance. This final entry was brief. The patterns are complete. The mountain has finished what it began. My observations are no longer needed. Time to rejoin the surface world. Despite extensive searching of the newly accessible cave areas, exploration teams found no trace of Coldwell himself, nor any indication of what might have happened to him after March 1967. The living area in the deep chamber showed no signs of having been abandoned quickly or under stress. Instead, it appeared that whoever had been occupying the space had deliberately and systematically removed most personal effects before departing. The systematic nature of the departure was evident in the careful arrangement of remaining supplies and the absence of personal items that would normally be expected in a long-term living space. Essential equipment had been left behind, but items with personal significance or identification value had been removed. This pattern suggested planned departure rather than emergency abandonment. The discovery of these deep chambers and the notebooks they contained forced authorities to reopen the Coldwell case, but the additional investigation produced more questions than answers. While the evidence clearly indicated that Coldwell had survived far longer than anyone had suspected, it provided no explanation for where he might have gone after 1967 or what might have motivated him to finally abandon the underground observation post he had maintained for over 3 years. Some investigators theorized that Coldwell had eventually decided to leave the cave system and attempt to return to normal life, perhaps in another state where his disappearance would not be known. Others believed that the physical and psychological stress of extended underground living had finally overwhelmed him, and that his remains were somewhere in the deeper cave passages that were still inaccessible to exploration teams. The theory of relocation to another area gained support from the systematic nature of his departure and the apparent completion of his research objectives. The final notebook entry suggested that Coldwell believed he had accomplished what he had set out to document and was ready to return to surface life. However, no trace of anyone matching his description was ever found despite extensive investigation efforts. The most unsettling theory, though never officially documented, was proposed by several geologists who had studied the cave system extensively. These experts noted that the acoustic properties of the deep caves could produce effects that might drive a person to believe they were observing intelligent communication from geological sources. They suggested that Coldwell might have spent his final years underground documenting natural echo and resonance effects that he had misinterpreted as meaningful patterns. However, this theory failed to explain the sophisticated nature of Coldwell's observations or the apparent consistency of the patterns he had documented over several years. The notebooks found in the deep chamber contained detailed technical data that demonstrated a level of understanding about cave acoustics and geology that exceeded what would be expected from someone suffering from isolation-induced hallucinations. The technical accuracy of Coldwell's later documentation was confirmed by professional review of his measurement techniques and calculation methods. His work showed understanding of advanced acoustic principles and geological processes that would normally require specialized education to master. This level of competence contradicted theories that attributed his observations to mental deterioration or misinterpretation of natural phenomena. The case was officially closed for the second time in 1970, with authorities acknowledging that while they had found evidence of Coldwell's extended survival, they had been unable to determine his ultimate fate or current whereabouts. The cave system was again declared off-limits to public exploration, and access to the deeper chambers was restricted to authorized research personnel. In the decades that followed, the story of Elias Coldwell became part of local folklore in the Virginia mountains. Park rangers and Forest Service personnel continued to report occasional unusual incidents in areas near Whispering Hollow. But these reports became increasingly infrequent as the original investigators retired and were replaced by personnel with no direct connection to the case. The forest itself seemed to settle back into its normal patterns, with wildlife returning to areas that had been notably quiet during the years immediately following Coldwell's disappearance. Hikers and hunters once again used the trails in the region without reporting the unsettling experiences that had been common during the mid-1960s. However, even today, more than 50 years after Elias Coldwell walked into the Virginia mountains for his final patrol, there are aspects of his story that continue to resonate with those familiar with the case. The methodical nature of his observations, the sophisticated planning that went into his extended underground survival, and the apparent completion of whatever research project had motivated him to abandon his surface life, all suggest a level of purpose and determination that transcends simple explanations. Perhaps most significantly, the acoustic phenomena that Coldwell documented in his notebooks have never been fully explained or debunked by subsequent scientific investigation. While experts have proposed various theories about natural cave acoustics and geological activity, none have been able to fully account for the complex patterns that Coldwell recorded during his years of underground observation. Modern seismic monitoring of the Blue Ridge Mountains has detected low-frequency acoustic activity that originates deep underground and follows patterns that share some characteristics with Coldwell's descriptions. However, the sources of these signals remain unexplained, and their apparent organization continues to puzzle researchers who study them. The cave system where he disappeared remains largely unexplored, with many passages still inaccessible to modern equipment and techniques. It is possible that the deepest chambers contain evidence that could finally explain what Elias Coldwell discovered during his years beneath the Virginia mountains. It is equally possible that some questions are simply not meant to be answered by those who remain bound to the surface world. The forest continues to keep its secrets, as it has for countless generations. The trees grow, the streams flow, and the mountains stand silent, holding within their depths mysteries that may be too profound for human understanding. And somewhere in the vast network of caves beneath Whispering Hollow, the echoes of Elias Coldwell's final observations continue to resonate through passages that no living person has ever seen, carrying messages that may never be decoded by those who walk in the sunlight above.